get started with the event, and our board member, Dave Edick, is going to do the introduction, and he's also going to do the Q&A. So as you have questions, please type it into the everyone box, and please just put questions there so that when Dave gets to the questions, he just sees questions in that question box. Thank you. So I'm turning it over to Dave.
Oh, thank you, Christine. This evening, we have the honor of hearing from Mr. Alan Bersin, long experienced on the border and highly experienced here in San Diego. Many of you on this call know him or know of him. But Alan Bersin served as Assistant Secretary for International Affairs and Chief Diplomatic Officer for the U.S. Department of Homeland Security, Office of Policy. In those capacities, Bersin oversaw DHS's international engagement, served as the principal advisor to the Secretary on all matters pertaining to international affairs, and was responsible for leading the department's strategic planning and policy formulation functions. Between 2012 and 2015, Alan served as Vice President of Interpol for the Americas region and was a member of the Interpol Executive Committee. Previously, Alan served as Commissioner of the U.S. Customs and Border Protection, where he oversaw the operations of CBP's 58,000 employee workforce and managed an operating budget of more than $11 billion geared to protecting the nation's borders from all threats while expediting lawful trade and travel. Between 1998 and 2006, Mr. Bersin was Superintendent of Public Education here in San Diego, and then served as California's Secretary of Education in the administration of Governor Arnold Schwarzenegger, and as a member of the California State Board of Education. Prior to this service, he was appointed by President Bill Clinton as the United States Attorney for the Southern District of California. Mr. Bersin served as U.S. Attorney for nearly 5 years, and as the Attorney General's Southwest Border Representative, responsible for coordinating federal law enforcement from South Texas to Southern California. Mr. Bersin is married to the Honorable Lisa Foster and the proud and happy father of 3 daughters. Congratulations. The floor is yours, Mr. Bersin. Thank you. And you're unmute yourself, sir.
And let me start by saying hello to so many friends that I see who have been here, and to thank the San Diego World Affairs Council and Christine and Dave in particular for arranging this. We have an opportunity this evening to share thoughts, and I look forward to your questions and comments on the presentation. But what I'd like to do is provide an overview with so many of you who were part of this, the border tales of the last 3 decades, because in fact we started much of what now characterizes the Mexico-U.S. border was invented here in San Diego, Tijuana. But before I have just a few slides to orient the discussion and provide some data points for you to consider. But I wanted to start with 3 broad propositions that I think characterizes the situation that we have in the United States and with Mexico today with regard to the border, the U.S.-Mexico border of 1,900 plus miles from San Diego, Tijuana to Brownsville, Matamoros, from the Pacific Ocean to the Gulf of Mexico. Remarkably, between 1994, when the modern era of border management began, and 2014, in the second Obama term, there existed in the United States, sometimes it's hard to remember a time when there was a broad consensus in our political system, but there was a broad bipartisan consensus regarding border management. And that consensus generated a series of security policies many of which, as I said, were created and invented here in San Diego, Tijuana, that led to significant success over the last generation of border life on the US-Mexican border. Between 1994 and 2014, 2 decades, there was, and I'll provide some data to back this up in a moment, there was a consensus about how the border should be managed, what it meant to have a secure border, and what the elements that were required to achieve it. That consensus, that bipartisan consensus over 2 decades regarding border security and immigration.
Sorry, Alan, I just put it on mute because somebody was coming on with interference. Sorry. So unmute yourself, please.
Good. That broad consensus that I've talked about that existed between 1994 and 2014 dissolved when the bipartisan Gang of Eight comprehensive immigration reform proposal, the one that was forwarded by Teddy Kennedy and John McCain, Chuck Schumer, Michael Bennet, Lindsey Graham, passed in the Senate a comprehensive and what was considered a very good comprehensive immigration reform bill. But it was never taken up by the Republican majority in the House of Representatives. And accordingly, the opportunity for comprehensive immigration reform died in 2014. And the deep partisan divide over the immigration issues that we've seen ever since in the last 7 years, with no end in sight, really dates from that period. And it's intensified as the middle of American politics has dropped from American society and American politics with the election of Donald Trump and now the election of Joe Biden. We see a policy swing, a pendulum that swings back and forth 180 degrees in terms of policy, a real contrast to the bipartisan consensus that existed before that. So the issue today in the Southwest really is not border security as such, but rather it's migration management. One of the points I want to share and test against your experience is that, in fact, the border is not out of control. It's not a question of security. In fact, today we see that migrants, 200,000 now a month, are coming to the US-Mexico border not to sneak in to the United States, not to avoid Border Patrol agents, but rather to find them so that they can claim asylum and take advantage of a broken immigration system, a broken asylum system that permits people to be paroled into the country, to wait for an immigration court hearing that is scheduled 2 or 3 or 4 years into the future because of the backlog that now exists in the US immigration court system. This is a very different situation from the one that existed in 1994 when the modern era of border management began. So in summary, there was a consensus, which I think I can demonstrate with some data that was sustained across the Clinton, Bush, and Obama administrations. That consensus almost resulted in a comprehensive immigration reform as a result of the Gang of Eight proposal. And that was lost when that bill died. And we've seen a polarization and a division on the immigration issue ever since. But the situation we face is not one of border security, but rather one of migration management. So let me provide some data, and Joe Eldred will help me if my share screen doesn't work, but I think we will have it. And I take it you can see the cover sheet. Let me go on and just go back and this is the continuing consequences of our broken immigration system from Trump to Biden. We have the result of this breakdown in the consensus and this division that led to one set of policies under Donald Trump and a almost diametrically different set of policies under Joe Biden. But let's go back to the beginning. This was the border that existed in Tijuana, San Diego in 1994. It was here after the ending of the Bracero program and the beginning of the Maquilador program, and most importantly, the passage of the North American Free Trade Agreement, NAFTA, in 1994, that led to a vast increase in Mexican migration to the United States because of the impact on the Mexican campesino. Whenever you start the kind of industrialization that NAFTA has triggered in Mexico, the first impact, and this has been true in history, the first impact of industrialization are the peasants, campesinos, who then faced competitive pressures from American agriculture as a result of the free trade agreement, left the campo, left the countryside, and sought work primarily in the United States. Because in fact, at that point, cities like Tijuana that would ultimately offer tremendous volumes of work to Mexican citizens was still in the development itself in 1994. But I remember when I first came to San Diego as the United States Attorney, and you see this is the U.S. side of the border. Every night, Mexican migrants would line up, and when nightfall came, they would run across the soccer field, across the Tijuana River Valley, and come to the United States. And there were so few Border Patrol agents in those years that in fact, all they could do would be to catch two Mexican migrants, and they'd be returned, and the next night those migrants would again try. More than 1 million Mexican citizens were being apprehended on the U.S.-Mexico border just in the San Diego-Tijuana corridor in 1994. And that's what led to the decision, largely, I think, politically, because of Governor Wilson in the 1994 election that year, made immigration, illegal immigration, the issue by which he was able to close a 14-point gap in the summer of 1994, that he was behind Kathleen Rice, the Democratic candidate, but the immigration issue caught fire in San Diego and then across the country. Proposition 187 was passed in the 1994 election, and we saw that the Clinton administration, of which I was a part in those years, reacted to the political pressure in California to actually start enforcement here and in San Diego, the two urban corridors in which irregular migration was taking place. But it was the beginning of this consensus that I mentioned at the outset. And if you look at this slide, you can see the growth in the U.S. Border Patrol budget, which is a good symbol of what happened starting in the 1990s. You have a $263 million budget in 1990. And here in this period of NAFTA in 1994, it grows slightly to 400 million. And then look what happens over the course of the next, basically the next 15 years, from 1995 to 2020 or 2019, where the Border Patrol budget grows to $4.696 billion. So look at that increase in a period of 15 years. It grows from 400 million to $4.7 billion. the Border Patrol grows from a force of 2,300 agents in 1994, or 2,500 agents, to 22,000 agents in 2019. Of that number, more than 19,000 are stationed on the US-Mexico border. 3,500 agents are in San Diego itself, in the San Diego sector, compared to 300 in 1994. So you can see this growth in resources. When I say that there was a consensus, a consensus, it's something that moved from 1990 to certainly 2019, when President Trump was still funding the border, but it had been funded from the Clinton administration in the 90s to the George W. Bush administration, to the Barack Obama administration, and then on into the administration of President Trump. But there was a huge consensus in which almost $18 billion a year. We saw $4.7 billion being spent on the Border Patrol, but that was only part of Customs and Border Protection, only part of the resources at the border in terms of the equipment, in terms of the vehicles, in terms of the sensor equipment, in terms of the air and marine resources. This is the consensus that existed that fell apart in 2014 at the time that the immigration reform was not passed. So you can see the impact of that increase in resources, and why I say it was not so, there was not a great, this consensus generated considerable effective border policy. Southwest border apprehensions from 1960, when they were virtually nothing after the end of the Bracero program and the beginning of the Maquila, but you see the growth of it, but it really explodes at the time in the late 80s, starting first with the Reagan, the last time we had comprehensive immigration reform in this country. And there was a huge migration surge because people wanted to take advantage of the amnesty that was part of the comprehensive immigration reform. Then there was a decline after that period of the amnesty. There was a decline again until NAFTA, and we saw in this gradual growth reaching a height from 1994, when NAFTA was passed, until 1999, when in fact we saw the height. And in 2000, we saw up in the largest number of border apprehensions that had taken place in American history since the Reagan 1.6 million, or just under 1.6. There were 1.6 million people apprehended in 2000. And then, of course, you see what happened after after NAFTA. You saw, leading to 9/11, there was a huge decline, and the border resources continued. And then under the Obama administration, there was a further precipitous decline. Let me get that. You could see the decline that took place. And two major things happened in this period after 9/11 with the increase in border control. But what was happening in this period, mostly in this period, was that Mexico also had been industrialized. And you saw Mexico assuming its position of an industrial powerhouse and an economic powerhouse, such that it became, in this period, the 13th largest economy in the world, with just under 50% of its people in the middle class by any standard that you use: birth rate, death rate, educational rate, housing, medical care, and the like. So that by 2017, more Mexicans were actually leaving the United States than entering legally or illegally. Take that in again. By 2017, Mexicans were no longer coming as they had for 7 decades as migrants to the United States, but more of them were leaving voluntarily and involuntarily than those that were entering legally and illegally. That's a remarkable change that that we have to really appreciate what was going on in Mexico that led to this result. So when President Obama left office, the fewest number of people that had been apprehended, under 400,000, had been apprehended, and that number in the end of 2016, beginning of 2017, was then the lowest that we had seen. And President Trump's rhetoric during the 2016 campaign led that number to move down actually more dramatically in 2017, so that we saw just about 350,000 apprehensions, which were a fraction of what they had been and reflected the border security situation that had been achieved over the previous 20 years. So then what happened in the Trump administration, which was openly anti-migrant, exclusionary in its approach to the border. And for the first year, we saw the number go down, but what happened afterwards was actually interesting. Let's see. Joe, I'm having trouble getting to the slide 5. Let's see if we can, I can get that to operate. Whoop. Let's see.
I have it if you want me to share my screen.
If you would, I'll stop sharing and you put slide 5 up. That'll be great. Thank you, Mr. Eldridge. Okay, and thank you. And this
Sorry about that.
So thank you. In this, let's watch this very carefully. In 2017, as we showed, the numbers were at the lowest in terms of monthly apprehensions. And over the course of the year, they were down to under 50,000 a month, well under 50,000 a month. And we were at the lowest that we had seen in almost 50 years at the US-Mexico border. And then what happened in 2018, in the Trump administration, we saw it the second year, it started to tick up. And then look what happened in 2019 in the Trump administration. The number of migrants that were coming in and being apprehended were reached a height of they rose steadily in 2019, so that in fiscal year 2019 in May, they had risen all the way through the spring of 2019, and they reached the height in May of 2019 of 144,000 people at the border. And then you see that it declines. And the reason that it hit this height in 2019 was that smugglers and migrants had realized that the Trump administration policies were actually a lot of hot air, and that in fact they could still come to the border, and enter the United States, but not by sneaking into the country, but rather by claiming asylum and taking advantage of the fact that you could claim asylum and then you were permitted to come into the country if you passed a very low threshold test called the credible fear test that then let you enter the country to wait for a hearing in front of the immigration court. But because of the backlog that we'll see in the immigration court, those hearings were scheduled 2 and 3 and 4 years into the future. Many of the people who were in the country never showed up. About 50% never showed up at the hearings. And those that did, actually only 25% were granted asylum and the rest were not. So the word got out, do not show up for the hearing. And I'll show you that. But look at what happens in 2019 after the hype. And what happened here was the beginning of the migration protection protocols. The Trump administration realized that all of what it had been doing at the borderline would not stop the asylum seekers because they could get into the country not by sneaking in, but by claiming asylum. And everything they did to try to stop that. And you'll remember the series of things that President Trump tried. He tried to get an emergency appropriation to build a border wall from Brownsville to San Diego. He declared a national emergency and shut down the government to try to get the money forced to build the wall. He declared a national emergency and sent active duty military troops for the first time to the border. He sent the National Guard to the border. He did everything, but everything was done at the borderline, but it didn't address the problem because it was not a border security issue of people trying to sneak by. It was a problem of a broken asylum system. And that's what we needed to face. And we'll come back to this, but a major change took place in those years, 2017, 2018, 2019. Mexican migration, as we saw, had decreased. So there was a net outflow of Mexicans from the US. Mexicans were being employed in Mexico. Mexicans were economically benefiting and thriving in the working class, and they did not need to migrate. So who was it that were coming in 2018, 2019? It was people from the countries of Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador, the Northern Triangle. And this was the new normal. Joe, if you can go to slide 6, this will actually depict the new situation and all of the issues that pushed people out, that had pushed Mexicans out for 40 years, but no longer were operating. We're now actually operating in Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador. Poverty, violence, crime, insecurity, organized crime and drug dealing, climate change, and the drought and the destruction of the coffee crops in Guatemala, for example, the armed conflicts of the 70s and 80s and the destruction there. All of these factors pushed people out. And in fact, 500,000 migrants started traveling toward the United States, mediated by smugglers. And if we go to what they did was, it was clear that they would overwhelm the Border Patrol capacity. And the next 2 slides show when people show up and they are claiming asylum, you see unaccompanied minors were in Border Patrol stations. But the next slide shows what was going on here. Here's a Border Patrol truck, and here are the Central American migrants lining up, not trying to avoid the Border Patrol, but to be processed for asylum. And that then led to the situation that's become very common now, seen starting in 2016, then coming again in 2017, 2018. And in 2019, President Trump made these people, these migrants who would apply for asylum, no longer could stay, were no longer were permitted to come into the country to wait for an immigration court hearing. Instead, they had to wait in Mexico, espera en Mexico. And that was the migration protection protocols. But if we go to the next slide, you see the impact that it had. And this scene is what we saw last month. This is a 2019 scene in El Paso, but this is exactly what was seen with Haitians last month in Del Rio, Texas. So, Joe, if we can go back to slide 5, the statistics, we'll see what happened when Joe Biden came in. No, that's it. When Joe Biden came into office, what happened almost immediately? The word got out that it was a new administration and that the attitude toward migration was different. And even though the pandemic was still underway and the public health restrictions were there, decision was made by the Biden administration not to keep families from entering the US, not to keep unaccompanied children from entering the US, with the result that we saw in 2020, you saw a slight increase. And then in 2021, with the pandemic restrictions not being enforced as much, you saw something that we hadn't seen ever on the US-Mexican border. We saw the numbers start to rise, and you can see it happening from 71,000 October, November, December, to Joe Biden coming into the White House, and then you see the numbers start to rise. 173,000 in March, 178,000 in April, 180,000, moving toward 200,000, which were reached in July and August, moving toward the largest number of migrants to be encountered at the border in 2021. But this is a function of, again, not a lack of border security, but a broken asylum system. People being permitted into the country to wait for their immigration court hearing. And in fact, what we see happening is that if you go to slide 11, Joe, you'll see the result is the immigration court system. That's it. In 2013, 2014, when that bipartisan agreement I talked about ended, you saw what happened at the end of the Obama administration, throughout the Trump administration and into the Biden administration. The backlog grows from 400,000 cases to 1.4 million cases in a period of 7 years. So that, in fact, the ability of the immigration court to hear these petitions for those that show up, and remember 50% are not showing up, puts us in the situation where people are in the country in an irregular fashion. The next slide shows what there we go.
That's the last slide I have.
Okay, well, let me see if I can. There should be another one that's the Executive Office for Immigration Review, the adjudication statistics. Let me see if I can, if you stop sharing, let me see if I can get those last couple of slides up. Okay, no, my screen is still but let me give you the, it shows that the denial rate from Obama to Trump went up dramatically, more than 55% of the cases were being denied. Rate stayed about the same, but what has increased dramatically is the disposition of cases in what the category is called other. This means the case was abandoned, not adjudicated or withdrawn. And the reason that number is going up dramatically is because, in fact, people were being led to the country and they will withdraw petitions that had filed. They were not adjudicating them because this was the way of actually then dropping out of the system and not having a record. What we need and what we don't have is a fix to the grade system, starting with the migration asylum process. And as a result of the breakdown in the consensus that we've seen, there is no congressional action, and you see this movement that has really led to a paralysis in terms of migration. We have an impasse between the political parties, and as a result of that, Democrats, when they're in power, they tend to open up the border. When the Republicans are in power, they tend to close down the border. And that is something we have not seen before, and turns out to be I think, a very dangerous situation for our political system. So let me take a moment to discuss the relationship with Mexico, which has been absolutely critical. Because as we've seen and was demonstrated during the Trump administration, you cannot, in a global world, control migrant flows at the borderline when people can claim asylum and then be admitted into the country. When this occurred with unaccompanied minors and with Central Americans coming at the end of the Obama administration, President Obama, through Secretary Jay Johnson, who was the Secretary of Homeland Security at that point, worked with the Peña Nieto administration to actually start cooperating on ending the flows coming up through Mexico that had traditionally been Mexican, but now were Central Americans. And Mexican authorities started to control migration at its southern border with Guatemala and Honduras and across in Belize, but less so in the Belizean border. That's what led to the decrease in the number at the end of the Obama administration, was the cooperation of Mexico. And then when we saw the numbers go up in the Trump administration, as I indicated, it could not have been controlled had not President Andrés Manuel López Obrador agreed to the migration protection protocols, in which thousands of Mexican migrants were across the border in Mexican cities, being metered to come across to actually have their asylum petitions heard. But it was done very slowly, and then it stopped after the pandemic and in March of 2020. But this was again cooperation of Mexican authorities, who also under AMLO deployed the new Guardia Civil to the southern border of Mexico to slow down the movement across the border into Mexico and then on to the United States. That's what led to that decrease in migration. What's happened right now, and the reason the numbers are still so high, is that even though Secretary Mayorkas and Secretary and National Security Council Jake Sullivan and Secretary Anthony Blinken, Secretary of State Anthony Blinken, has actually gone to Mexico and asked for Mexican assistance in stopping the flows from Central America. In fact, the numbers that are coming are so great now that, in fact, even the Mexican efforts to slow that down at their southern border, which are not, frankly, as vigorous as they were in the Peña Nieto administration or during the Trump administration, those efforts have not slowed down the flows from Central America, because, in fact, the message of the Biden administration has been a mixed one. Vice President Harris may go to Mexico, or Secretary Mayorkas might go to Mexico and say the border is not open, as Ambassador Jacobson, when she was briefly in that role, said the border is not open. But the word is different. The word that's getting back to the sending countries of Guatemala, El Salvador, and Guatemala is, even though that's what they say, the fact of the matter is, relatives are calling back to those countries on their cell phones saying, we're in, we've gotten in. And the only people that are really being stopped are single males who are still being expelled under the Title 42 anti-pandemic control measures. But families and unaccompanied children are still coming into the country. And that's the decision that the Biden administration has taken for reasons that actually respond to the political promises, so to speak, that were made to advocacy groups during the campaign. But it's the swing of the pendulum from Trump exclusion to a relatively open border that is actually something that is not sustainable. As long as the messages go out in a mixed fashion, as long as there is not a credible deterrent, either because of Mexican action at its southern border or US efforts to make clear that you cannot come into the country and then not show up for your immigration court hearing, until that stops, the smugglers will continue to come, and they will continue to be subsidized by undocumented families in the United States that understandably wish to be reunited with their children and with their relatives. They will pay the smugglers to bring people up to the border, claim asylum. 75% of the people are then admitted into the country. And the result will be a continued surge from Central America. What happened recently with Haitians follows the similar pattern. After the 2010 earthquake in Haiti, 2010, tens of thousands of Haitians actually emigrated, many to this country, but many also to Brazil, where they were given work in the construction industry as Brazil prepared to host the 2016 Olympics. What's happened is that those Haitians who were living in Brazil with their families and with children that were born in Brazil, and then many families also Haitian families moved to Chile. You saw when the Biden administration came in and declared that the temporary protective status for Haitians was being maintained, you saw a large migration from Brazil up through South America to Colombia, and then through the Darien Gap, then up through Central America into Mexico. And Mexico had warned the United States that while it would work to control Central American migration, because those people, those migrants could be returned across the border to the Northern Triangle countries, that the Mexican government could not return Haitians to Haiti. And therefore, those Haitians ended up under that bridge in Del Rio, Texas. Again, even though there were plane loads of Haitians that were flown back, with declarations from administration officials that people were going to be deported back to Haiti. In fact, after a while, many thousands of Haitians were released into the country in the way in which people had been released because of the broken asylum system, given notices to appear in immigration court. But frankly, the expectation must be that most of those folks, for reasons that we should understand, will not show up at the immigration court. So that's where we stand in mid-October of 2021. 200,000 people coming to the border, many being in the United States, with political ramifications and implications that remain to be seen in the 2022 midterm elections. It's an issue that is exploited mercilessly and has been, as an issue of the border being out of control. Let me again, and I hope I've been able to persuade you that the border is not out of control. The immigration system is broken. We have a problem of migration management and not border security. So let me stop there, because I know that this group, my many friends and many of the people who have watched the border situation for many years will have many questions, and I hope they'll be hard and fast ones. Thank you very much.
Alan, thank you. Thank you for an outstanding presentation. Before we get into the Q&A, I do want to bring the audience your attention to an article that Alan has written for migration policy. If you open up the chat function at the top of the chat, you'll see a link to the article. It's a serious analysis, perspective, and prescription, actually, of how to deal with things going forward. As moderator on behalf of the San Diego World Affairs Council, I'm going to ask each person to identify themselves and their affiliation when you're called on. And as moderator, we get the prerogative of the first question. And on behalf of the board of directors of the San Diego World Affairs Council, Alan, if you would update us on the status of the USMCA trade agreement and characterize the current trade relations between Mexico and the United States, what's working, where there may be challenges, and AMLO's perspective on cross-border trade and investment. I'd appreciate that.
Sure. I'd be happy to do that. And then I see in the chat there's some excellent questions, and be happy to turn to those as well, and others that may have. So as a result of the pandemic, as the USMCA, or TMEC, as it's known in Mexico, took effect in 2020, it really, by the third quarter of 2020, this very strange pandemic year, we saw a real decline in U.S. imports by value from Canada and Mexico in the second quarter of 2020, which was obviously when the three countries announced the pandemic restrictions for so-called non-essential traffic. But the supply chain was maintained and trade was maintained, and you could see the impact of the agreement because we saw nearly a full recovery in the third quarter. Second quarter, we saw a real decline. Third quarter, as USMCA and TMEC took effect and border restrictions were stabilized, firms started to adjust, and we started to see the robust trade that has been a staple since 1994, that has led to the kind of economic growth that we've seen in Mexico with the impact that it's had. We saw that continue in 2020. The situation is continuing, But let me show you the difference in what happened and how dramatic the trade was and the impact of the TMAC or USMCA. Trade recovered in one quarter, in the third quarter, and has continued to grow. But contrast that with what happened with the cross-border movement of people. And this will touch on the Title 42 restrictions that we can discuss in a moment. But in February 2020, and this is the Canadian data, but comparable situation in Mexico, in February of 2020, 3.2 million people crossed the border. And in February 2021, 244,000 crossed the border. Think about that impact on San Isidro and on border communities all across the country. Same thing with regard to air passengers. In February of 2020, there were 2.7 million air passengers in the North American travel zone. In February of 2021, it was 5% of that, or 140,000. So you see the importance of the USMCA, because in the trade space, we saw continued growth. Now, where are we today as we get to the end of 2021? When you do a poll of Mexican executives, you'll see that Mexican executives actually expect there to be more growth by the end of 2021 than either their business counterparts in Canada or Mexico. Survey respondents to the question of where is trade going, will it continue to grow? 81% of, interestingly enough, of Mexican respondents, notwithstanding what is perceived in the business community, I think, in Mexico as a AMLO administration that is decidedly not friendly to business, 81% nonetheless expect to see an improvement in business performance driven by Mexican exports to the US. In Canada, this picture is reversed. A minority expressing optimism. 36% believe there'll be an improvement. And executives in the US are fairly neutral. 60% there'll be continued growth under US MCA. With regard to the business, because so much of our trade actually is energy-based, the Mexican government's proposed constitutional amendment to dismantle the electricity market actually is likely would be considered a violation of USMCA and other investment treaties that exist. So that's a question mark as we move forward. How far will the AMLO administration proceed with the constitutional amendment to dismantle the energy market and continue its efforts with regard to the hydrocarbon market? What is interesting, though, is that Mexico, while it continues to be the major trading partner with the United States, during the first 6 months of 2021, US global trade increased 23.6% compared to the same period last year, and 5.8% from 2019. But the fastest growing US trade partner was actually Vietnam, with bilateral trade going up more than 50% from the same 6-month period 2 years ago. Now, the US deficit with Vietnam through the first 6 months of this year is larger than the deficit for the entire year of 2018. Why is this happening? And I think we need to see what is going to happen. I don't think that. I think what will explain this is the trade pressures with China, caused both by the geopolitical tension between China and the United States, but also because of the forced labor restrictions that the US is now enforcing with regard to regions in China, such as the Xinjiang region, where there have been import bans imposed and enforced by CBP. And many people, observers, believe that what's happening is that there's a lot of transshipment of Chinese goods to Vietnam and then from Vietnam into the United States. If that's the case, I'm sure over the next year, you will see a lot more import bans imposed against Vietnamese trade. So, in fact, I think we're seeing a huge continued impact of USMCA. During the first half of 2021, US-Mexico trade with Mexico grew 32% compared to 2020. Mexico solidified its position as the US top trade partner during the first half of 2021. And we saw imports and exports to the US exceeding 2019 levels. So I could go into specifics. One that caught my attention was that tequila exports have grown 21% this year compared to 2020, which was already a record-setting year given the pandemic, and 86% of tequila exports from Mexico go to the United States. Been an enormous amount of tequila consumption during the pandemic in the United States. And but reciprocally, the amount of corn that the U.S. is exporting to Mexico is growing hugely. So the bottom line, I think, Dave, is the U.S.-Mexico-Canada agreement, the Tratado México-Estados Unidos-Canadá, is continuing to generate robust trade results and will continue as the pandemic recedes over the next year and thereafter.
Oh, fascinating additions there. So going to move back to immigration and migration again. So I'm going to call on people and please identify yourself, your full name and your affiliation. Wendy Fry.
You're muted, Wendy.
Yeah, Wendy, unmute yourself.
Sorry.
got it.
Hi, Wendy from the San Diego Union Tribune. I was asking, and I think I typed part of that before. I think you answered a little bit of the last part of my question, but just can Biden unroll or unravel Title 42? And if he did, what would be the result of doing that? And then if he doesn't, and I think you mentioned, the difference is the people that are getting through, children and women, but besides rhetoric, is there really a big difference between Trump and Biden's immigration policy in practice?
So the migrant advocacy community, Wendy, is still very critical of Biden, notwithstanding the 200,000 people a month that are coming to the border, and almost tens of thousands of people are coming into the country to wait for their immigration court hearing. But there's still a lot of criticism because the Title 41 restrictions were not lifted, because that was the mechanism that the administration is using to actually expedite the removal of single males, both from Central America and from Mexico. The slight contraction in the Mexican economy and the decline in employment opportunities led to an increase for the first time of Mexican migration. It's still minor compared to Central American migration. But Title 42 is the way in which the Border Patrol and the administration is expelling those single males and getting them removed across the border, actually to try again with smugglers to come into the country. But that was presumably the reason why the Biden administration did not open up the border for non-essential traffic. Was the feeling was that if we If we lift Title 42, which will now happen in November for vaccinated people or people who can demonstrate negative antigen tests, people will be able to cross the border now for the first time, in spite of the Title 42. But the hesitation to lift it before was because of the irregular migration situation. But really, that was apples and oranges. So you will see the Title 42 remain in effect to deal with single males, but it'll be lifted to permit so-called non-essential traffic to come in if vaccination status can be demonstrated, or in fact a negative test. The court, that was shown when there was a court that actually enjoined the use of Title 42, but the appellate court, the Biden administration, to maintain use of Title 42, got a stay of that order, and that's why they continue to use it. But frankly, if Title 42 were lifted entirely, you could still use expedited removal procedures to expeditiously remove single males. But that's a decision that the Domestic Policy Council has chosen, and it's consistent with the mixed messages that are referred to. The border is closed, but the border is not closed. It depends on who was attempting to enter. But your question, I hope that's been responsive to your question.
Thank you, Wendy. Alan, we've got 4 questions in the queue. Michael, did you want to ask you posted up a question here about the number of Mexicans declining. And I don't hear him, but
Yeah, I'll follow up on that. Yeah, I think this person answered that to some extent. I guess a follow-up to that would be these Central Americans and others who are non-Mexican and showing up at our border with Mexico, asking for political asylum. Aren't they supposed to, under the law, ask for political asylum at the first country they come to where they will be safe? And if
so that's only Michael, excuse me, go ahead, finish your question. Sorry.
So why don't they seek that in Mexico? And in another way, I guess it's sort of an insult towards Mexico if people are coming and not seeking asylum there, if they feel in fear of their lives from their home country.
So in fact, there is not a safe third, there's something called a safe third country agreement with Canada that says that you cannot go to Canada and then come to the United States and claim asylum, but there is no safe third country agreement in place with Mexico. That's why, when I showed the decline in the number of people who were encountered at the border from May of 2019 onward, that was because the Mexican Espera en Mexico program, or the migration protection protocols, were instituted where people were not permitted to come into the country if they passed a credible fear test, but rather were required to wait in Mexico. So that was the difference. But the larger point that you made is an important one, which is we cannot manage or fix this migration management system without cooperating regionally with Mexico, with Central American countries, with Colombia. The flows of migration in the global world present a regional problem, as we've now seen with the Haitian situation coming from Brazil. You cannot wait for people to get to the borderline, but you must cooperate with other countries if, in fact, we're to manage this problem satisfactorily. Thank you for the question.
Thank you.
Thank you. Howard Wayne, tell us your affiliation. Are you out there, Howard?
Yes, I am. And let me turn on the video also when I cannot. I'm just a member of the council, so I'm not from the media. The question I have is, what do you think are the essential elements of immigration reform and of asylum reform?
Yeah. So the Gang of Eight proposal in 2012, at the end of 2012, 2013, that was passed by the Senate, not a perfect bill, but an excellent one nonetheless, in terms of its providing the fixes that we need for our lawful immigration system, as well as taking and providing for changes that would permit the border and migration to be managed rationally. The elements in asylum reform, because I don't think we will have a comprehensive immigration reform in the foreseeable future, meaning arguably not for the next 10 years or more. And if we don't deal with the polarization in American politics, we will not see it for until that problem is resolved. But asylum reform, it seems to me that there are two issues that should be able to get bipartisan support if you could create it. One is DACA. 70% of the American people approve of the Dreamers, and yet that issue, which we should have taken care of, which was in which the court kept the DACA program from being revoked, as sought in the Trump administration, has not led to anything that has addressed the needs of the Dreamers. That seems to me to be a key immigration reform that is doable and should be done. And then with regard to asylum reform, there is a basis for reaching an agreement that would permit people to apply for asylum, but not to, and for people who need protection to get it, but not to be in a position where people who are basically economic migrants, and I understand the sympathy of that, or people who have problems with gang issues or domestic violence, they should be permitted to claim asylum, but they can't do it by coming to the border, claiming asylum, and then not showing up for an immigration court hearing. So what I would propose, Howard, is that we actually start to do an offshoring of the asylum process, that we conflate the refugee process, which has always been handled offshore, and the asylum process. And that if people need protection in the same way that an asylum applicant or a refugee applicant can get protection while he or she and their family are being considered and vetted for refugee status, the same could be done in safe zones in southern Mexico or in the Northern Triangle countries, where people could apply, and you would have an expedited review of this by immigration officers from Citizenship and Immigration Services. And instead of taking 4 or 5 years, you would have these petitions adjudicated within 3 or 4 months with protection available, but not inside the United States, but rather outside. And since refugees and asylees are actually operating under the same standard, it seems to me that we could conflate those processes, and that would be something that could be done. The progressive left in the Democratic Party would probably not favor that, because it would stop the flows that are now entering the US. And the fact of the matter is the Trump administration, when it had control of the Congress, the Senate, the House, and the presidency, did not reform the asylum system. But this is something that should be done. And frankly, together with DACA, would be an important step in reforming those parts of the broken immigration system that can and need to be reformed.
Krista Tacey, are you out there?
Yes, I am. My apologies. I'm trying to find that mute button. I am attending as myself, but just for full disclosure, I do work for USCIS. So just that way, at least I don't sound presumptuous. But I think, Alan, you just actually answered pretty much what my question was what are your thoughts on the proposal that's on the table right now to allow asylum officers to actually adjudicate not just credible fear claims in defense of asylum cases, which are the ones that we see at the border, but to actually go ahead and adjudicate those defensive asylum cases like we do the affirmative asylum cases in country. I think you pretty much jumped on the things that I
think it would be a terrific, I think it'd be a
Yeah.
terrific idea and an important idea, coupled with this idea that it would be done offshore.
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah, you're right. Because I agree with you completely on this one. Those of the folks who are in the last session know that I had a few issues with some other thoughts from the last speaker, but this one is where I pretty much agree with you. Also, the whole getting off of their rear ends and doing something with the Dreamers. I mean, it's been sitting around since 2001. It was bipartisan then. The population wants it. Why we keep fighting over it, I just don't understand. You regularize those folks who had no say in the issue, and you like you said, handle those asylum cases overseas, because one of the things about refugee cases is that you're not guaranteed where you're going to go. You're going to go to the country where they take you. And that's a very different concept than, hey, I want to go live in America, and so I'm going to come and show up at the border. I think that a true refugee, a true asylee, because that definition is the same from an international perspective, as you noted, is going to go wherever they can go. This is more pointing to that economic migrant issue.
Listen, family reunification. Thank you for your service
Yeah.
at citizenship and immigration.
Thank you, sir.
But the fact of the matter is that's why we need a regional approach to this. And
Absolutely.
if they're family unification issues, they can be dealt with, but not in the context of letting people choose where they apply.
I'm probably a little bit biased just because I served in state in Mexico for several years, actually, probably while you were at the border. So I saw it from that side as well. And like you said, there's just a point at which, there's can be a lot done if people just focus on what they need to do. And we have got to get the laws changed, because we can't enforce something that isn't written in a clear and implementable manner. Thanks.
Well, we're right down to the end here. Alan, I think maybe we can fit in maybe one more question with a brief question and a brief answer. And my apologies to the other people in the queue, but Surin Dutia.
Thank you. My name is Suren Dutia, and I think I understood you to say that comprehensive immigration legislation is not likely to come to fruition for a long time. But what happens to some of the essential programs like H-1B and others, which are so critical to keep our economy strong?
Absolutely, and this was taken care of reasonably well in the Gang of Eight proposal, and is a necessary element, and would clearly be done if we could ever put together the political coalition to pass a comprehensive immigration bill. That's what we lose. The same, as Krista said with DACA, the H-1B to get technically competent people and trained people and the people that make the economy, that bring innovation, that is so critical to our economy. Absolutely. That's what we lack when we don't have the ability to get people moving across the aisle to make deals that are in the interests of all of us. That's the problem.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Oh, Alan, we promised you to hit a timeline, and we've hit it. My apologies to the other people with questions out there. I'm sure they're good. We could keep you here deep into the evening, but I want to thank you on behalf of the San Diego World Affairs Council. Thank you for your time and attention. And
very good. I thank you. I thank you. And Dave, I have a couple of minutes, and this has been such a good, and the questions are good. If you don't mind, I'll give a very short lightning round response to the questions that I see that remain, if that's all right.
Okay.
I'll do it quickly, but thank you. So Reno Harnish asked, what size of funding would be necessary to get Central America to stop exporting their citizens? This is a question of, of course we have to deal with those push factors, but this is not something of giving the what I consider to be quasi states that cannot protect their citizens, states that cannot provide for their citizens. This is not a question of providing money to those governments. This is, I think, an issue of actually addressing the kinds of reforms that need to provide the economic capacity that took place in Mexico over the last 40 years. And it's not going to happen overnight. It's going to take decades, but we have to start that process in Central America. And then Murugapa Madhavan asks, what is the current status of Vice President Harris's efforts to help Central American development? I think it's fair to say that they have stalled and they have not taken a route because, in fact, we haven't been able to develop the kind of comprehensive approach. We cannot use traditional foreign USAID programs. And while I respect USAID immensely, a gang program here, a preschool program here, a food relief program, you cannot get the kind of change incrementally that it's going to take to reform societies that are oligarchically controlled, are frankly thoroughly corrupt, and need reform. And this is going to take the kind of multilateral effort, not gunboat diplomacy by the US, but concerted effort. And frankly, that capacity doesn't really exist today. And then let me just say to Wendy Fry, the idea of expanding the legal immigration system, as Mr. Dutia indicated with the H-1B, obviously we should be doing it with the H-2A, which has an unlimited number of visas, and we should be doing it with the H-1A. There's no question that we should be providing legal routes for people to come into the United States to meet labor market needs in the country. I think that's covered all of the questions, Dave, and thank you for and Christine for giving me a moment to address, because I think people who have attended, I wanted to respond to them. But thank you, and with that, I will thank you all, thank the council again for the opportunity, and look forward to visiting again in due course, Christine and Dave.